Stephen and his wife came home for a visit after a long time. My dad and I were excited and prepared a special meal for them. "Here you go, enjoy your meal," I said as I laid out the food. But Stephen, without a greeting, started eating and exclaimed,
"This is terrible. Order some fancy steak instead. Eating this will make me sick."
His rudeness left me speechless, while Rosalie just laughed mockingly. I couldn't believe they would complain about the meal we prepared with so much care. This meal was made especially for them. Dad and I had put so much thought into it. Stephen and his wife's behavior had always been less than ideal, but this was too much. I couldn't stay silent any longer. It was time to make them realize their place. Dad seemed to feel the same way. "My name is Karen, a 60-year-old housewife. I live with my dad. My mom and my husband passed away long ago, and I was worried about leaving Dad alone at his age. So I moved back to my childhood home to start a new life with him. My husband and I had one son. Stephen has already moved out and started his own family. Stephen's house is a bit far from ours, so we don't see each other very often. Though I used to feel lonely, now I think the distance is appropriate. Then we got word that Stephen and his wife would be visiting for their summer vacation. We were overjoyed to see Stephen and his wife after such a long time, especially Dad, who was enthusiastic about planning how they would spend their time during their stay. Then came the long-awaited day when Stephen and his wife were returning home. Our house is quite far from the airport, so Dad and I went to pick them up by car. We waited for Stephen and his wife to arrive, but no matter how long we waited, we didn't see them. Even after a couple hours, we still couldn't find Stephen and his wife. We were sure we were at the right terminal. Feeling anxious, I texted him and asked, "Where are you now?" Then Rosalie replied, "At home." At home? Wondering what was going on, I called, and Rosalie answered the phone languidly.
"Karen, what do you want?"
She sounded as if she had no idea why I was calling. Filled with anxiety and unsure, I gathered the courage to clarify. "Wasn't today the day you were supposed to come over?" When I asked, Rosalie replied,
"Oh. Actually, we overslept today. We couldn't book any new flights, so we decided to go tomorrow. Sorry, I forgot to let you know,"
she said. I couldn't believe it. It's one thing if they couldn't come due to unavoidable circumstances, but to miss the flight because of oversleeping and not even bothering to contact us. Rosalie's words were like trampling on our feelings, as we had been looking forward to this day, and there was no hint of remorse for their actions. But I couldn't afford to say harsh words and create a fuss. I swallowed my anger and confirmed their plans again. Stephen and his wife promised to come the next day, and we ended the call.
"So they're not coming today?"
Dad, who had been looking forward to seeing Stephen and his wife, was disappointed to learn they wouldn't come today. Seeing him like that pained my heart, and my anger towards Stephen and his wife grew, but I held back and decided to go home for the day. The next day, as promised, Stephen and his wife arrived at our house. I was worried they might oversleep again, but fortunately, they made it today. We picked them up from the airport and brought them home. Then Stephen said,
"Just show us to the guest room for now. I'm tired from the long journey."
I guided them to the guest room, thinking how tiring the long flight was, and said, "You must be tired, rest up. But we'd be happy if you showed up later. Dad and I will be glad to see you." Then I returned to the living room. Dad was concerned, asking,
"How are Stephen and his wife?"
I told him they seemed tired, and that it was best to let them rest for now.
"That's true."
Dad agreed, so we went about our business, waiting for Stephen and his wife to come out of their room. But no matter how long we waited, they didn't come out. When it was time for dinner and they still hadn't emerged, I thought something was wrong and went to check on them in the guest room. Then I heard a voice from inside.
"Seriously, Karen and her dad are so annoying."
It was clearly Rosalie's voice, Her tone was a mix of irritation and mockery.
It would have been better not to bother with this tiresome visit. I wish we had overslept today and just skipped it altogether.
Don't even say that. You didn't oversleep yesterday either.
Stephen retorted to Rosalie's words. At Stephen's response to Rosalie's words, a small "what?" slipped out from me. I quickly covered my mouth, but it seemed that Stephen and Rosalie inside the room hadn't heard me. They didn't oversleep? Does that mean they lied about oversleeping so they didn't have to see us? That's unforgivable. We had prepared everything for their arrival. If they didn't want to come, they should have just said so. Their behavior, as if looking down on our efforts to maintain a relationship, was infuriating. But I had to get them to eat dinner. Despite not wanting to call them, I worried it might cause more trouble if I didn't. So I took a deep breath and knocked on the guest room door. "Can I come in? I came to let you know that it's almost time for dinner." After a while, Rosalie responded,
Just a moment, please.
and then Stephen and she emerged from the room. I led them to the living room and sat down at the dining table with Dad, laying out the prepared dishes. Dad, perhaps in an effort to get along, chatted with them. They responded with forced smiles and engaged in conversation, creating a seemingly pleasant atmosphere. "Please help yourselves," I said after setting the table. As Dad whispered a prayer, they joined in. As everyone started eating, Stephen suddenly blurted out,
This is awful. Order some fancy steak instead. Eating this will make me sick.
What? Stunned by Stephen's abrupt words, I wondered if the meal was really that bad. The food tasted fine to me. I couldn't help feeling anxious. Noticing my reaction, Rosalie smirked mischievously. I had reached my limit. We were sincerely looking forward to Stephen and his wife's return home. For that reason, we had been making various preparations. But what they did was nothing but betray our feelings. Despite our efforts to welcome Stephen and his wife, they failed to reciprocate, mocking us and acting in ways that seemed to entrap us. Our feelings just didn't seem to matter. Our efforts seemed futile. Faced with this reality, I felt dizzy. Unaware of our feelings, Stephen and Rosalie were discussing which delivery service to order from on their cell phones. I couldn't take it anymore. It was unreasonable to keep trying for people who behaved this way. I wasn't the only one who felt this way. Dad and I exchanged glances and decided to take revenge.
Was the food really that bad?
Dad asked. Stephen, still smirking, replied,
Yeah, it's awful. Grandpa, don't eat this. Let's order some fancy steak. This food will make you sick.
He then showed his phone to Dad. Rosalie joined in, suggesting to Dad,
I recommend this.
My eyesight is bad. Sorry, but can you pass me your phone?
Dad asked. Stephen handed it over, saying,
Sure.
Dad then threw the phone into the trash. Stephen and Rosalie looked at Dad, puzzled.
What are you doing, Grandpa?
Stephen asked, retrieving his phone from the trash with a panicked look. He glared at Dad, filled with anger, but Dad was also trembling with rage.
I helped prepare today's meal,
Dad said. Stephen and Rosalie exclaimed in surprise. What? Actually, Dad was also excited about Stephen and Rosalie coming over today, so he helped with the cooking. Dad isn't particularly skilled in the kitchen, so he just assisted with simple tasks. But he was delighted, hoping Stephen and Rosalie would enjoy the meal. However, their attitude was terrible. It's no wonder Dad was angry. After all, the special meal prepared thoughtfully for them was unfairly criticized as disgusting and upsetting the stomach. Moreover, this criticism wasn't based on the actual taste or quality of the food, but was just harassment from Stephen and his wife.
Leave. This is the last time we'll ever meet. Never show your face to me again,
Dad shouted, trembling with quiet anger. Stephen and Rosalie, surprised, said,
What?
Grandpa, are you serious?
Stephen and Rosalie were bewildered. They probably hadn't expected to be reprimanded so severely.
George, aren't you overreacting? We didn't mean any harm. It was just a joke.
Grandpa, please don't say such harsh things. We love you, so don't be so cold, okay?
Stephen and Rosalie were trying to appease Dad, but Dad, apparently not willing to accept any of their words anymore, said,
"Just go,"
and kicked them out of the house. Afterwards, the doorbell rang several times, and Stephen and his wife shouted,
"Let us in,"
from outside, but we ignored them until they finally left. The revenge had only just begun. We were resolved to thoroughly torment Stephen and Rosalie. With this determination, I formulated the next plan. Meanwhile, Stephen and Rosalie apparently had to stay in a hotel for a few days before returning home. A few days later, they sent various complaints via text, but I assumed they were just bluffing and ignored them.
"You did such an unreasonable thing. I will never forgive you."
"Even if he's Grandpa, that was too much. You need to scold him too, Mom."
While casually responding to their words, I showed Dad their messages saying, "This is what they're saying." Dad sighed deeply and remarked,
"They haven't learned their lesson at all. We need to discipline them more."
They were unwittingly continuing to provoke Dad's anger. Dad's second plan for revenge was quite simple. The next day, my phone rang loudly. It was a call from Rosalie. I was reluctant to answer, knowing what to expect, but curious about how much they had been cornered, so I decided to answer.
"Karen, something terrible has happened,"
Rosalie said desperately as soon as I answered. While calming her down, I asked, "Calm down, what happened? Explain everything from the beginning." Rosalie began to narrate the events. Today, while she was relaxing at home alone, she received a call from a real estate agent. Surprised, Rosalie answered the phone, only to be told by the agent to leave the house immediately. She pressed the agent for a reason, but the response was only that the house was being sold. From Rosalie's perspective, it was unbelievable that the house they were living in was being sold all of a sudden. She had no idea how to handle the situation. Furthermore, Stephen was at work and not answering his phone. That's why she called me for help.
"I really don't know what's going on. This is too strange."
Rosalie's voice conveyed a sense of real crisis, sounding truly distressed. Indeed, it's no wonder she was shocked, being suddenly told to leave a house where she had been living calmly. Feeling a bit sorry for her, I decided to explain the situation to her. "Rosalie, it seems you've been misunderstanding this whole time, but that house isn't yours."
"What?"
Apparently, she truly knew nothing about it. I then explained everything from scratch. "Actually, that house belongs to Dad."
"What?"
The house where Stephen and Rosalie were living was originally one of Dad's vacation homes. Dad, a well-known wealthy man, owned several such properties across the country, and the house they were living in was one of them. Dad had paid for all the expenses to build the house, which was in his name. When Stephen and his wife got married, Dad generously decided to give them the house as a gift. It seemed Stephen had never mentioned this to Rosalie. Even so, they should have respected and not upset Dad. Dad, extremely angry over their terrible behavior, contacted a real estate agent to put the house up for sale. The house had been rarely used and was considered unnecessary before they moved in. So you see, you should never have gone against Dad, but since you angered him so much, this is a natural consequence, right? I couldn't help but smile at their misfortune. As I said this with a mischievous grin, Rosalie shouted in an angry tone,
"I didn't know any of this. Please forgive us. If I had known George was such a powerful person, I would never have acted that way."
Rosalie, desperate, implored me. In the past, I might have succumbed to her intimidating words, but now, with a stronger heart, I wouldn't yield to Rosalie's demands or let her have her way. "This is your own doing, a natural consequence. Deal with it yourself," I said, about to end the call. Then Rosalie exclaimed,
"Wait, please,"
and I could hear her speaking in the background. After a moment, the voice on the phone changed.
Mom, is that you? What's happening?"
It was Stephen's voice. He probably had been informed by Rosalie, possibly through a text. He seemed to understand the current situation.
Why are you suddenly selling the house? Is Grandpa there? Let me talk to him right now.
Stephen was speaking rapidly, pressing the issue. He probably understood that the only way out was to convince Dad to stop the sale of the house. Just then, Dad, who had been out, came home. Seeing me on the phone in the living room, he asked,
"Who's calling?"
I told him I was talking to Stephen, and at his request, I switched the call to speakerphone.
"Stephen?"
Relieved to hear Dad's voice, Stephen pleaded,
"Grandpa, please don't just sell the house like this. If we lose this house, we'll be in trouble."
If they couldn't persuade Dad here, Stephen and Rosalie would be left without a home, facing difficulties in their future life. They had to convince Dad to support them and somehow redeem their past actions. But Dad sternly replied,
"There's nothing more to discuss with you two. Just give up and leave that house."
Dad said. Stephen, crestfallen, muttered,
"But..."
Yet undeterred, he persisted.
"Grandpa, don't you care about us? If you sell the house, we'll be left homeless and suffer. Are you okay with that?"
Despite the hardships, Stephen seemed to have no choice but to believe in Dad. He desperately tried to change Dad's mind, but Dad was unmoved, saying,
"My decision is final. Leave that house now. You're obstructing the real estate agent."
Stephen, perhaps in despair, said nothing more. What Dad did might be considered excessive by general standards. Some might say that there was no need to push them to such an extent. However, the emotional wounds we suffered justify this retribution. We believed Stephen and his wife were family. Dad, in particular, cherished them as grandchildren and lent them the house for free as a wedding gift. Additionally, Dad regularly sent them money and provided assistance whenever they struggled. Dad never doubted that Stephen and Rosalie were family. That's why he consistently treated them with respect and affection. Yet Stephen and Rosalie's actions grievously betrayed Dad's feelings. Dad's anger was entirely justified, because Dad was so deeply despondent. Having his actions for Stephen and Rosalie negated, this was the most hurtful thing for Dad. I, too, was affected by Stephen and Rosalie's actions, enduring much distress. But the wounds Dad bore were immeasurable. Just thinking about it was heart-wrenching. Just give up. Your actions have led to this. Dad has made so many efforts to keep you as family, and you've betrayed all of it. Now, when cornered, you suddenly change your tune. Isn't that shameful?" I said, unable to contain my anger. Stephen, in desperation, pleaded,
"I know, but I'm sorry, really, sorry. Please forgive us. Don't make us suffer anymore."
But I knew my words would hardly resonate with Stephen. No amount of urging seemed enough to prompt genuine remorse and a change in their behavior.
"Don't call us anymore. Talking to you makes me sick,"
Dad said, picking up the phone and ending the call. Stephen desperately tried to stop Dad, saying,
"Wait, please."
But Dad, unmoved by such words, hung up and handed the phone back to me. Afterwards, Stephen and his wife called several times and texted me, but we ignored them all. We had no obligation to respond, as we had become strangers to each other. During that time, a certain piece of news came to us. Stephen and Rosalie had divorced. Apparently, since that incident, they were constantly fighting, causing endless rumors in the neighborhood. Unable to endure such a life, Rosalie decided to initiate the divorce. Stephen, having lost his affection for Rosalie, agreed, and they smoothly went their separate ways. Rosalie returned to her parents' home, hoping to be taken care of, but upon learning of her past actions towards us, her parents turned her away. Now she seems to be living alone. Stephen came to our house, wanting to live with us, but I couldn't bear the thought of living with him after everything, so I turned him away, telling him never to show his face again. Stephen, too, has become a lonely figure. With Stephen and Rosalie, the troublesome duo, gone, we now led a peaceful and happy life. Stephen and Rosalie's presence had been more of a burden than we realized. Feeling relieved and less exhausted without them, our lives became more comfortable. We had received a lot of help from Dad. We also caused him a great deal of worry. When I apologized to him, Dad smiled kindly and said,
"I did what I wanted to do."
Thanks to Dad, we were able to cut out the unnecessary and instead focus on valuing ourselves in our current situation. And so I'm going to live each day, never forgetting to be grateful to Dad.